it water with the sheep in the box?
When you think of the right wing, especially the far right, from crypto-fascists to old-school conservatives, what do you think of? Well, most of the time it'll be racism, toxic masculinity, anti-Semitic dog whistles, and an inability to bring a woman to orgasm. But those are just the attributes we can observe from, well, observing these people. The impression they actually want to convey is that of the strong, powerful traditionalist and patriot, who stands up for Western, Judeo-Christian and white— oh wait, sorry, I wasn't supposed to say that last one out loud— values, in the face of a crumbling, immoral world in crisis, and chief among these values they claim to hold, but in reality will only accept under circumstances where it benefits them, other than refusing to touch a clitoris, which is just a given, is that of freedom of speech. The right love to talk about freedom of speech, whether it be Jordan Peterson claiming that acknowledging trans people's preferred pronouns and outlawing harassment based on gender identity is literally the same as Stalin's Russia, to Tim Allen insisting that he should be able to publicly say the N-word, to even Dennis Prager himself, who appears to genuinely believe that YouTube declaring videos espousing intensely bigoted and borderline fascist viewpoints as unsuitable to some advertisers is infringing on his First Amendment rights. We in the UK, along with much of Europe, have a much less fundamental view of free speech than our American friends. We don't even have a constitution to start with, and as a result ideas like freedom of speech are not quite as highly politicised. For example, the BBC, the public broadcaster, showing a clear preference to one political party over another is extremely frowned upon in the UK, and there have been multiple calls for the political editor to be fired as a result, unlike in the US, which generally tolerates Fox News. Likewise, often when it comes to freedom of the press, these rights are highly regulated, due in part to the fact that not too long ago, a few of the Murdoch-owned newspapers were caught actively breaking the law and hacking into the voicemails of recently deceased teenage girls in the name of journalism. Not that freedom of the press doesn't exist, because for the most part it does, but much like Fox News in the US, many of the UK news outlets are controlled and operated by billionaires. The point is, freedom of speech is often used as a right-wing talking point that means very little, and certainly isn't about the right to free expression. Most of the time it's used by conservatives is to justify saying shitty things and avoiding consequences. Yeah, well, I don't care if I called you awful things, you arguing with me is infringing on my freedom of speech, which obviously isn't how it works. This isn't a video about freedom of speech as a concept though, more as it exists as a tool for the far right to win political points by framing wanting people not to call black people the N-word as taking away patriots' First Amendment rights, and other less obvious examples. It allows the right to take the moral high ground and gives them the ability to claim that the left actually want to take your freedom of speech away. It's therefore not a huge step to start noticing when free speech is used as a sort of crypto calling card, a dog whistle, where when they say we care about free speech, what they actually mean is we're neo-Nazis. Charlottesville was pitched as a free speech rally, and any attempt to silence or deplatform Nazis is viewed as censorship or, again, violation of free speech. Likewise, when people like Steven Crowder and PragerU whine about platform holders and corporations, which they usually refer to as big tech or Silicon Valley tech companies, banning or restricting access to people who break their terms of service, they are fundamentally misunderstanding the concept of free speech. Also, no, Nazis getting punched isn't censorship. Freedom of speech isn't freedom from consequences. So, I wonder what PragerU has to say about free speech. They obviously don't understand it, considering that they tried to sue Google over their belief that being demonetized over breaking terms and service agreements that they agreed not to break is censorship, so I'm sure they have some reasoned points and arguments to make here. Here are the videos we're going to be talking about today. 1. Why I left the left. 2. Control the words, control the culture. 3. Does free speech offend you? 4. How to become a dangerous person. And 5. Preferred pronouns or prison. First up is Dave Rubin, the ultimate grifter, who regularly hosts far-right figures and lets them spout off whatever bullshit they want without bothering to challenge them in any way, but will occasionally have a lefty on in order to shit on them and keep up the appearance of being neutral and have an excuse to claim to still be a liberal, much like Joe Rogan and his shitty podcast, but I'm sure he's going to be fair and balanced here.
Do you believe in free speech?
Yes, but you don't, Dave, as we found out when you threatened to sue a journalist for daring to associate you with the far right, just because you regularly platform people like Lauren Southern, Milo Yiannopoulos and Stefan Molyneux to spread their ideas without any real degree of pushback on them, and yet are more than happy to provide pushback to relatively innocuous guests like Stephen Fry for using your trigger words.
So it isn't. That's what I mean by being empirical.
Right,
well,
that's a tough.
I'm not saying, therefore, you must have a king and queen in order to be free. But all I'm saying is, having one doesn't stop you from being freer, from being opener. I mean, these are very open societies, Denmark and Sweden and Norway in particular, incredibly open societies.
Yeah. But they're suffering a little bit from their openness, aren't they, right now, with all this immigration stuff? I mean, it sounds like some of the underpinnings of it are...
It is. It's becoming problematic, there's no question.
And tried to stop NFL players utilising their right to free speech to oppose police violence by kneeling during the national anthem.
Do you believe that people should be judged by their character, not their skin color?
Yes, but again, you don't, Dave. You failed to push back against Stefan Molyneux when he outright just stated that black people are genetically inferior to white people. Oh, and you let him get away with just saying provably incorrect shit, like black people are stupid because they have smaller brains, for fuck's sake.
So if you look at criminality, right? I mean, as you know, black males are... young black males, 3 to 4% of the American population responsible for more than 50% of the homicides. You look at what goes on in the South Side Chicago. It's horrible. And yet, in general, it is not, if you normalize by IQ, everybody who has an IQ of 85 has similar levels of criminality. Whites in America have a certain particular level of homicide that's pretty low. And whites around the whole world have the same level of homicide. Whites in England, whites in Belgium, whites in America, all have the same level of homicide. And the question, of course, is environment versus genetics. I would love to have a clear answer to that. Science is making its way forward, but it's such a volatile topic that a lot of scientists would rather do anything than delve into this particular topic. But it's extraordinarily heartbreaking, and it means to me that no amount of screams of racism can be guaranteed to solve the problem. And I think, isn't that what we've seen? That the consciousness about race and racism has gone up so enormously. And good, because there was definite racism in the world. But without this central fact, and it is a fact at the moment, even if we say it's 100% environmental, it's still a fact at the moment. Even if we say,
But is there evidence that it's genetic?
Yes.
I'm not a geneticist.
Yes.
So genetic in what regard? I mean, if we took the brain of a 25-year-old black man and the brain of a 25-year-old white man, what is it that they're doing that...
different sizes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, this is dependent on every ethnicity, the higher IQ. In general, there's lots of exceptions and so on. There are different sizes. There is evidence that if you take a white kid from a middle-class household, for whatever reason, ends up being raised by a black family, the white kid's going to end up about 100 IQ. If you take the average black kid, have them raised by an upper-class middle white family or a Jewish family and so on, they're going to end up at about 85.
Do you believe in freedom of religion?
Once again, something I believe and you don't, Dave, considering that you'll tweet shit like this arguing that opposing Islam is the only moral and acceptable thing to do.
If you believe these things, you're probably not a progressive. You might think you're a progressive. I used to think I was. My show, The Rubin Report, was originally part of the Progressive Young Turks network.
Yes, because you are a grifter who has no principles or morals and who realised that he could just make significantly more money being a useful tool for the far right in much the same way as Milo was, and Lauren Chen and Blair White continue to be, or as Dennis Prager himself put it,
I want you to continue to say you're a liberal because you're of great use to good values.
Well, don't worry, I'm not doing it for your use of me. I'm doing it for myself.
No. It's like Christians who say to me, we would love you to come to Christ, but you are so valuable to us as a Jew when you defend us Christians. Yeah. And they're right. You are valuable in the best sense of the word because America needs people who are clearly liberal and to be honest, and fall into the category of kosher as gay, to say, hey, hello, the conservatives are not hate mongers. Hello, they should be heard. And maybe every so often you should read National Review.
Right.
Or watch a PragerU video.
Yeah, you don't get to hold the moral high ground, Dave. Also, the Young Turks outlined their side of the story here.
A few weeks ago on the Young Turks, I addressed my former colleague, Dave Rubin. He was someone I considered a close friend for years until he completely blindsided me with his anti-progressive TYT bashing world tour following his departure from TYT Network. For years, I avoided addressing his lies on air. To be honest, we were such such close friends that I thought things would somehow get better. But I made the mistake of thinking he was an honest actor and that the TYT bashing would stop. But I was wrong. I noticed that he had this habit of inviting someone on his show to say the most controversial things, and he would never challenge them. And that was an ongoing pattern. Mike Cernovich, Milo Yiannopoulos, and other questionable characters made regular appearances on his show, and Rubin just let them say whatever they wanted without any pushback. Now, to be clear, I'm not opposed to interviewing these people. Joe Rogan has all sorts of controversial people on his podcast, and I find it fascinating. The difference is that Rogan sometimes engages in the conversation and doesn't let people go unchallenged. Rubin had found a way to profit off lying about TYT in addition to providing a platform for the alt-right. So I finally had enough. He was lazy when he worked here. He's lazy now with his ridiculous show where he proves time and time again that he doesn't know anything. And why do I know he's lazy? Why did he really leave the Young Turks? Can I please finally tell the truth about why he left the Young Turks? He wanted to make a 6-figure salary to host a 30-minute-a-week show when everyone here, because we work for an independent news company, was getting paid far less while working 12-hour days. That's why Dave Rubin left the company.
Progressives struck me as liberals, but louder. Progressives were the nice guys. They looked out for the little guy. They cared about women and minorities. They embraced change.
We have yet to get a definition of progressivism, by the way. I'm sure it's coming though, so I'll be patient.
In short, who wouldn't want to be a progressive?
Ooh, I know. A spineless, capitulating, right-wing, grifting coward who wants to use his past when he had principles as currency in order to demonstrate that actually the left are the real fascists, not the people who say that black people are stupid because they have smaller brains.
But over the last couple of years, the meaning of the word progressive has changed. Progressives used to say, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. Not anymore. Banning speakers whose opinions you don't agree with from college campuses, that's not progressive.
Right, okay, so we're going to have to go over this for the first time in what I suspect will be a long series of repetitions of the following phrase. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. Yes, most of us on the left absolutely believe that you probably shouldn't be arrested for saying offensive shit, but that's it, and that's actually what US law defines freedom of speech as. It doesn't mean that you have a right to a platform, or can demand that universities pay you obscene amounts of money to spread bigotry, and protests or universities responding to complaints by cancelling lectures are not taking away your freedom of speech because you're not owed shit, and certainly not an extremely well-paid spot as a guest lecturer. Likewise, you can yell racist stuff in the street, but if someone takes issue and decides to punch you in the face, that's not restricting your freedom of speech, that's you receiving consequences as the result of irresponsibly using your freedom of speech. There are limits on free speech, Dave. You can't yell fire in a crowded theatre, you can't say you're a police officer when you're not, you can't deliberately try to incite violence. Sorry, but if you want to change that, complain about the First Amendment, not people being upset that their college invited a bigoted moron of a guest speaker onto campus, and I guess petition Congress to take away the freedom of speech of universities by mandating that bigots be given a platform regardless of whether or not they're wanted.
Prohibiting any words not approved of as politically correct. That's not progressive.
What are these words? Are you talking about the N-word? Because if so, I really don't think that's a bad thing.
Putting trigger warnings on books, movies, music, anything that might offend people, that's not progressive either.
Oh, Christ. Right, so first off, trigger warnings are not restricting freedom of speech because the speech still exists, it just has a warning at the beginning, much like how some movies have that warning about flashing lights from people who might struggle with that for health reasons. These warnings were applied because certain subject matter can cause severe harm to people who suffer from, for example, PTSD. What if I wanted to put a trigger warning on this video, Dave? Why are you censoring me? Don't you care about my freedom of speech? You conservatives are such sensitive little snowflakes.
All of this has led me to believe that much of the left is no longer progressive, but regressive. This is one of the reasons I've spent so much time on my show talking about the regressive left.
Okay, so please explain to me how conservatism, the ideology that literally exists to try to drag society back to a non-existent, better time, is not regressive. These people idolized the 1950s for fuck's sake. How do they not see the irony?
This regressive ideology doesn't judge people as individuals, but as a collective. If you're black or female or Muslim or Hispanic or member of any other minority group, you're judged differently than the most evil of all things, a white Christian male.
Oh my god, these conservatives and their victim complexes. Please, for the love of God, give some examples of what you mean, because as far as I can tell, this is just lies so far.
The regressive left ranks minority groups in a pecking order to compete in a kind of oppression Olympics. Gold medal goes to the most offended.
Nobody does this. Don't get me wrong, we on the left acknowledge that certain minority groups experience different levels of prejudice or, yes, oppression, but it's not like a spreadsheet or competition or anything. Besides, most of the time we try to work together to fight all oppression wherever it is. We call this intersectionality, but you can call it solidarity if you want. Also, what is going on with that podium? Have PragerU never actually watched the Olympics? Why are there 4 positions? What medal does the 4th person get? And why is the white woman deemed more oppressed than the 3 other people of minority groups? Didn't Dave just say that white people aren't considered oppressed by progressives? It's not about being offended, it's about fighting for equality and trying to resist injustice. I'd bring up MLK and ask if Dave believes that he was just an offended snowflake liberal, but, well...
Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that his children would be judged by their character and not their skin color was a liberal idea, but these days it's not a progressive ideal.
Yes, it is. The problem is that our society overwhelmingly doesn't judge people of minority groups due to their character. After all, if that were true, I imagine that a lot fewer black people would be shot by police who suspect them of being criminals based on their race. The police in general don't seem very good about judging people by the content of their character, and neither do the news outlets referring to black people as thugs half the time.
And what about religious freedom? The idea that no one else can tell you what you have to believe. Surely progressives still support that basic right. Well, not so much.
Yes, they do, though. Your position that Islam is a fundamentally harmful ideology sort of flies in the face of this kind of shit, doesn't it?
I'm a married gay man, so you might think that I appreciate the government forcing a Christian baker or photographer or florist to act against their religion in order to cater, photograph, or decorate my wedding. But you'd be wrong. A government that can force Christians to violate their conscience can force me to violate mine. If a baker won't bake you a cake, find another baker. Don't demand that the state tell him what to do with his private business.
If a corporation doesn't want far-right propaganda on its servers and thinks that doing so might be harmful to its image, don't let the state dictate what Google should do with its business. Find another video hosting platform. Otherwise, you're attempting to use the state to restrict the freedom of speech of private companies, which I thought you were against. Oh wait, no, sorry. I guess you're either a hypocrite or you've changed your mind and you think that you should be able to sue that baker for not making you a wedding cake. Christ, conservatives really do have no principles, huh?
I'm pro-choice, but a government that can force a group of Catholic nuns, literally called the Little Sisters of the Poor, to violate their faith and pay for abortion-inducing birth control can force anyone to do anything. That's not progressive, that's regressive.
Sorry, what is this? What is he talking about? Is he just making this shit up? Hang on a sec. Oh, okay. Right, no, this is because US healthcare is so fucked up and inhumane. It looks like what happened was that in 2011, the Department of Health and Human Services issued a federal mandate as part of the Affordable Care Act, which required employers to provide contraception in their health insurance plans, and this conflicted with the religious beliefs of the organization. Now, there are 2 points I want to make here. The first being that Rubin doesn't acknowledge this, but the Little Sisters of the Poor actually took their case to the Supreme Court and won, so it's not really helpful to his point about tyrannical governments. Maybe legislation that wasn't thoroughly considered. Secondly, and more importantly in my opinion, the Little Sisters of the Poor aren't all nuns. Many of the carers and other employees are, well, just ordinary Americans, which means that by winning this case, they're able to potentially compromise the health of their employees on religious grounds, even if those employees don't have the same beliefs as them, which in my opinion is pretty fucked up, especially considering that, for example, getting an IUD fitted can cost thousands of dollars without insurance, and the Little Sisters of the Poor don't appear to pay amazing wages from what I can tell. Also, as we've seen, lower levels of birth control often leads to higher levels of abortion, which seems like something they'd also be against, but I guess conservatives don't like to think about the consequences of their actions if it hurts people they don't like.
Today's progressivism has become a faux moral movement hurling charges of racism, bigotry, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, and a slew of other meaningless buzzwords at anyone they disagree with.
These words have meanings, Dave, but it would be really great if you could give examples of these being incorrectly or unfairly applied to ordinary people, as opposed to just whining about how your racist, bigoted, xenophobic, homophobic and or Islamophobic friends are occasionally called out for their racist, bigoted, xenophobic, homophobic and or Islamophobic views and rhetoric.
The battle of ideas has been replaced by a battle of feelings, and outrage has replaced honesty.
Are you serious? I hate to break it to you, but from shit like IQ to climate change to trans issues to social science, the facts are overwhelmingly on the side of the progressives here, and people like your mate Stefan Molyneux are either lying or making arguments from feelings. People on your show have been disgusted when they find out that you're gay.
A liberal homosexual says, well, you should accept my lifestyle. But if you say, well, I accept your lifestyle, I just don't want my kid to be one. Well, you're a bit. Well, wait a minute. I accept the fact that you want to be homeless. I don't want my kid to be homeless. I accept the fact that you want to smoke crack. I don't want my kid to smoke crack.
What do we do from here? What do we do from here? Like, I think most people, I know a lot of my audience is going to hear you, really hear you, and go, this is the type of stuff that I think needs to be heard more. And I think that the group of people that are talking about this stuff is actually growing. I do see this. At the same time, the people who don't want to hear us are getting more and more hysterical because that's all they got left.
Even said they hate Dave Rubin because he's a gay man with the wrong opinion. Dave Rubin is gay? No! He got a husband? I did not know. I was in his presence. I didn't know. I shook his hand. I sat down with him. Why did y'all tell me before I went on his show? Oh, Stephen, why would you send me this? Oh my God, Stephen, you ruined my day.
People who claim incorrectly that trans people are just mentally ill, a few of whom you've platformed on your show without meaningfully disagreeing with them, are ignoring the vast majority of the science, as are climate change deniers and flat earthers and so on. They're just upset that people could dare to see trans women as women, or, in other words,
these are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings.
Diversity reigns supreme as long as it's not that pesky diversity of thought.
First off, why is diversity bad? And secondly, in what context? Should a news broadcaster, when talking about climate change, have on a climate expert and some internet weirdo who reckons that climate change isn't happening because it gets cold in his house sometimes? When talking about the International Space Station or satellites or something, should we talk to someone from NASA and also a flat earther for balance? Because that seems fucking pointless. There's no point having diversity of thought if it means that half the people represented are scientifically wrong. All that means is that those viewpoints are legitimized and treated like they're just as valid as the truth by being platformed alongside the truth.
This isn't the recipe for a free society, it's a recipe for authoritarianism.
That's funny because the USA is often touted as the freest country in the world and is currently led by an actively anti-progressive government. And what a surprise! There are concentration camps on the border, kids are being killed for being the wrong colour, minority groups are being oppressed and hate crimes against them have increased. The police have increased levels of power and ICE can arrest, torture and deport people deemed too foreign with basically no evidence or warrant. But no, it's the people asking everyone to maybe not be as racist that are the real authoritarians, right?
For these reasons, I can no longer call myself a progressive. I don't really call myself a Democrat either. I'm a classical liberal, a free thinker.
We've seen this trick before. Classical liberal is a phrase right-wingers like to use to pretend that they're not right-wing whilst holding explicitly right-wing positions. This argument stopped working last year when Carl Benjamin, who loved using the classical liberal talking point, joined and ran for office under UKIP, the UK's far-right party that pretty much no longer exists because it's been replaced by the Brexit Party. Turns out there is no such thing as UKIP or the Brexit Party, there is only the Nigel Farage Party.
And as much as I don't like to admit it, defending my liberal values has suddenly become a conservative position.
What did Rubin's mates at TYT say about his turn to the right again?
And now all of a sudden he's getting funded by the Koch brothers, and all of a sudden his opinions are very different. He has no political identity. He is not an honest actor. He is not an intellectual. He is a fraud.
So if you think people should be able to say what they think without being punished for it, that people should be judged by their behavior, not their skin color, and that people should be able to live the way that they want to live without government interference, then there's not much left on the left for you.
I love when they do this. Okay, let's go through it all, shall we? First off, under the current American police state, you can lose your job for putting the word pig on a police officer's coffee cup, which, going by Rubin's own logic, would be a violation of freedom of speech, and I would say definitively goes against the idea that you can say what you want without being punished for it. People are already judged by their skin colour, otherwise the US legal system wouldn't be prejudicial towards black people. The Trump administration has introduced a ton of legislation to interfere with the way people want to live, from immigration to LGBTQ+ rights, to women's rights, to workers' rights. The thing about the far right is that they love to cut rights as the left fight to expand them. Only one of these positions is supportive of allowing people to live the way they choose without interference, and it isn't the people trying to cut all your legal rights.
I'll keep trying to explain that to progressives until I'm totally left out. I'm Dave Rubin of the Rubin Report for Prager University.
Well, that was a mess of misinformation, lies, and hypocrisy. What's up next? Sadly, there's not much to say about Michael Knowles. He's an extremely minor celebrity on the right, most well known for hosting the Daily Wire's third podcast. He made the classic I have no real arguments joke of releasing a book called Reasons to Vote Democrats, a Comprehensive Guide, which contains 266 empty pages and an extensive bibliography, which became a bestseller after Knowles licked Trump's boots on Fox and Friends, and Trump in return praised Knowles' book as a great book for your reading enjoyment. In April 2019, Knowles gave a speech at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, entitled Men Are Not Women, because of course conservatives love to ignore the provable science that shows that trans people are who they say they are, and in September 2019 was so horrendously offensive that he caused Fox News to apologise and promised to never have him on again. What did he do to earn this dubious honour? Well, he insisted the at the time 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg, in order to dismiss climate change as an idea, dismissing her as a mentally ill Swedish child, and when called out for attacking a literal child who just wants the planet not to be uninhabitable, responded, I'm attacking the left for exploiting a mentally ill child. She is mentally ill, she has autism, she has obsessive compulsive disorder, she has selective mutism, she has depression, because disabled or mentally ill people have no right to speak and are all stupid, right? Fox apologised on his behalf, but he refused to because, of course.
Why does it matter whether we call someone who breaks the law to enter the country an illegal alien or an undocumented immigrant?
It doesn't, but is he going to go on to argue that it's good to call people illegal aliens because actually dehumanizing desperate people is okay, in the same way as previous PragerU videos have?
Dominant media outlets use the euphemism undocumented, but the official U.S. government term, used in federal statutes, is illegal alien, an unlawful entrant who came without permission and stays in open defiance of our laws.
What's the difference between a Christmas tree and a holiday tree?
There isn't one. Call it what you like, it's a fucking tree, and I genuinely have never met anyone who seriously wanted to have a holiday tree. Also, the one on the right looks much better. Are you not allowed to have fun things like lights or tinsel on a Christmas tree, or is that just a holiday tree thing? By the way, aren't stars still religious, representing the star that guided the wise men to Jesus? Just saying. And of course, that's without going into the fact that our current tradition of decorating trees around wintertime is a direct descendant of ancient pagan traditions, wherein people would bring evergreen trees, plants and leaves into their homes upon the arrival of the winter solstice, which occurs in the northern hemisphere between December the 21st and 22nd, to celebrate the return of life at the beginning of winter's decline. Druid priests in Britain also used evergreen plants and mistletoe in pagan ceremonies, and the mistletoe plant was the symbol of the birth of a god. Celtic Druids and Norsemen of Scandinavia also used mistletoe in a ceremony the purpose of which has mostly been lost to history just after the winter solstice.
It's just semantics, right? Yes. And no. It is just semantics, but semantics means the meaning of words.
Yes, but usually the phrase, at least in the UK, is it's just pointless semantics, not it's semantics in general. But even if it was, sorry, but whilst words do have meanings, often those meanings, or even the words themselves, can change. Sticking with the Christmas theme, the figure of Santa Claus can vary wildly from culture to culture, especially with his name, from Father Christmas to Sinterklaas to De Kerstman and so on. These things are not set or universal by any stretch.
Words exist so that we might discriminate one thing from another. Without words, we have chaos.
Not quite true. Words exist so that we can communicate ideas to one another, as long as we all know what is meant, which, let's be honest, when someone says happy holidays or refers to a holiday tree, we all do, then frankly the change of words makes no difference. No one under the age of 60 calls these pikelets, but no one's all that upset about the change of name there.
And it starts with the first words. A baby says mama to distinguish mommy from daddy.
No, babies say their first words because those are the words people say most to and around them. Additionally, because they use repeated syllables, even in other languages, for example mama and dada in English, papa and tata and so on elsewhere, this makes it easier for the child to say their first words. Likewise, they're not saying, I am saying mama to differentiate you, mother, from my father and or other strangers. Most of the time they're just saying words they hear said at them. Later on, sure, they can refer to the parents as mum and dad or whatever, but those words aren't set in stone. You can call your mother mom, mum, mummy, mother, ma, mater, and so on.
Words shape how we think. They color how we view the world.
I'm sort of on board with this idea. After all, referring to vulnerable refugees as illegal aliens definitely causes some people to view them in a different light.
No one understands this better than the left. They are the masters of words, because they know that words matter. The left has a special gift for euphemisms, soft words selected to sugarcoat harsh realities so as to make those harsh realities easier for us to swallow. But these soft words are insidious. Their sole purpose is to deceive.
We're going to see a few bullshit examples in a minute, but I just want to point out that the right coined phrases like alternative facts refer to their imperialist interference in the Middle East as bringing freedom to the region, and the systematic murder and borderline extermination of large swaths of the vulnerable and disabled as austerity policy or tightening our belts, but it's just the left that uses euphemism, right?
Race discrimination in hiring and college admissions is refashioned as the much nicer sounding affirmative action. Who would ever oppose an affirmative action?
Okay, for a start, it's not as simple as race discrimination, and amusingly enough, he's actually using his own word games to obscure the true purpose of these policies, which were put in place to combat the very real race discrimination black people face in the hiring stage of employment. Likewise, the right love to discriminate based on race, and then act like actually they discriminate based on IQ or education or prison record, when black people are likely to have experienced worse education due to a number of factors, but including the funding for black schools being lower, and are therefore less likely to score highly on an IQ test, regardless of whether or not their actual intelligence is comparable to their white counterparts, and due to the discrimination against black people by both the police and the courts, are more likely to have a prison record, despite having the same level of criminality as white people. They call black people who commit crimes thugs and white murderers lone wolves or misunderstood, and yet think they have a leg to stand on when whining about black people being given a helping hand into the workplace in order to at least help combat the society-wide discrimination.
Global warming, which can be measured and challenged, has morphed into climate change, which means essentially nothing because the climate is always changing.
Oh god, I forgot PragerU were climate denialists due to their funding from oil billionaires. No, the phrase climate change did not replace global warming, though we generally started to use it more because moronic people like this kept saying shit like, they say the world's getting hotter but it's still cold in my kitchen, but they actually do refer to separate phenomena. Climate change refers to extreme weather and climate phenomena such as the recent unprecedentedly severe Australian wildfires, increase in frequency and severity of hurricanes, flooding and so on, and of course global warming simply refers to rising temperature on Earth and the sea level rise that comes as a result of the melting and reducing ice caps. This isn't just me talking out my arse, by the way, this is directly from NASA themselves.
When Barack Obama became president, George Bush's war in Afghanistan suddenly transformed into the far less ominous and threatening Overseas Contingency Operation. That's one way to try to end a war, just rename it.
Yeah, this is fucked up. Fuck the US military, fuck their continued and ongoing imperialist bullshit, and especially fuck the military-industrial complex that incentivizes these forever wars and narrowly avoided dragging the world into another conflict with Iran after the US murdered one of their most powerful political and military figures. I'm not going to defend this because, unlike this guy, I actually know what the left is, and Obama ain't it.
The examples are endless. There's a new euphemism every week. In the make-believe world of leftist language, young criminals have become justice-involved youth. Mandates and taxes are individual shared responsibility payments.
I've genuinely never heard these phrases used in my entire life. I don't know where he's getting this, but it's clearly far from widespread or an accepted phraseology on the left.
Government spending becomes an investment.
The investment thing, I guess you could argue, has been used when it comes to public services. Like, I definitely agree that spending public money on the NHS or renationalising our rail services, which would have been nice, might count as investment because doing so pays in the long term.
Wanting to keep more of your hard-earned money becomes greed. Taking more of someone else's money is them paying their fair share.
Now who's playing word games? I assume he's talking about the super rich here because they're the ones who people mostly want to tax. First off, capitalism is not a meritocracy. I don't want to go into it too much in depth here, but as I discovered in an old video, nurses are probably some of the hardest working people in the world, working 12-hour shifts, doing thankless, emotionally and physically draining labour, often for poverty wages. In fact, many nurses in the UK don't earn enough to buy food, so have to rely on the charity of others to survive. And on the other end of the scale, Jeff Bezos, the guy who owns Amazon and as far as I can tell doesn't work nearly as hard as the average nurse, earns between 1.5 and 4 million times more than a nurse's starting salary. Unless you can seriously argue that Jeff Bezos works millions of times harder than a nurse, or even his own employees who he underpays and exploits to an incredible degree, then sorry, but the hard-earned point here is bullshit. Secondly, the reason people call it greed is because these people do not need this money to survive. They could give away 99% of their money tomorrow and still live an incredibly comfortable lifestyle unattainable for the majority of people, but they don't. Billionaires could could end world hunger, poverty, homelessness, and climate change overnight, using the money they gain through exploitation of the working people to do so if they so chose, but they don't, because they prefer to keep the money for themselves. That's why we call them greedy, not because they want to keep more of their hard-earned money. I hate to break it to you, but a lot of people out there actually believe that human lives matter more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Crazy, I know.
Opposing a Democrat in the White House is obstruction. Opposing a Republican in the White House, resistance.
These refer to two different groups of people, though. During Obama's second term, the Republicans did everything they could to block all his bills, stop everything getting through Congress, and, yes, obstruct Obama's policies in any way they could, whereas the resistance are members of the public protesting the president and his brutal, inhumane, and cruel policy proposals online. You can't really compare the two.
In the name of diversity, the left enforces intellectual conformity. It censors opposing views in the name of tolerance.
Right, so no we don't. We do not tolerate abuse or bigotry, and we'll laugh at and argue with right-wingers, but we don't want them arrested for fuck's sake. This is the tolerance paradox all over again. As originally defined by Karl Popper, less well known is the paradox of tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational arguments and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be unwise, but we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their own fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerance. For example, allowing Nazis to speak freely, hold rallies, and spread their ideology promotes intolerance, and yes, can and has led to the rise of fascism. Should these people be arrested? Probably not, but they certainly shouldn't be given platforms or soapboxes from which to spread their ideology, and granted the ability to organise.
And it labels all non-left views hate speech.
No, we label all hate speech hate speech. Interesting how this guy seems to think that hate speech is synonymous with right-wing views. Could it possibly be because right-wing ideology is inherently hateful? Surely not. It's weird that so many of these people will go around saying they call everything hate speech now, as if that means anything. Like, hate speech has an actual definition, you know, so if we call something hate speech that doesn't line up with that definition, please feel free to go ahead and call us out. But if what we're calling out does match the definition of hate speech, well, maybe it's hate speech.
Consider the ongoing battle over pronouns, whether to call a man who thinks he's a woman he or she.
Oh Christ, read a fucking book, PragerU, or better yet, look up all the various studies that have been carried out into gender identity and gender fluidity, from which the scientific consensus that trans women are women and trans men are men has been derived. Oh, who am I kidding? The right will never actually value facts while they have such strong feelings about people with whom they disagree.
Very few people in the country suffer from gender confusion, and we should have compassion for those who do.
It's 1%. That's 3.27 million US citizens who qualify as transgender. Also, gender confusion is an outdated and long since discredited and inaccurate term. Trans people are not just confused. The science does actually show this pretty definitively.
But the left has invested countless funds, time, and energy to make everyone refer to some men as she and some women as he.
No, the left has put time, effort, and money into trying to combat bigotry and spread the scientific fact of the matter, which is that trans women are women and trans men are men. It honestly takes a lot of effort to research, write, and animate a video this slickly without once taking a glance at Google to have a look what the scientific consensus on this issue might be, so I guess congratulations, PragerU, on your impressive level of ignorance.
Why? Is it because the left is so compassionate? Or is it more likely because so much of the left's cultural agenda is about blurring, even denying, the natural distinctions between men and women?
Fucking hell, this is some cultural Marxism shit. The left are doing everything they can to destroy the natural distinctions between men and women by supporting minority rights. Isn't too far off. The Jews are doing everything they can to destroy the nuclear family by putting gay people in oven chip adverts, and makes about as much sense. I know they'd love to believe it, but there is no conspiracy. We honestly do not give a shit about blurring the lines between the sexes. We care about facts and justice. Everything else attributed to us is just deranged, paranoid conspiracy nonsense. The science shows that trans people are valid. Compassion would dictate that we treat vulnerable people with decency and respect, and justice suggests that trans people deserve rights and recognition. Honestly, 50 years ago this guy would probably be crying about the left wanting to blur the line between black and white people because they supported the civil rights movement.
Sometimes it's just an adjective that can change or even negate the entire meaning of the word it describes. Take social justice. Justice means getting what you deserve without favor. Social justice means getting what you don't deserve because you are favored.
That's not what those words mean. Here are the actual definitions. Please stop lying when the definitions of these words you're making up fake definitions for are readily available and just a couple of seconds away.
Here's one we hear a lot these days. My truth. Truth is reality regardless of any individual's feelings or perceptions. My truth is how I perceive things regardless of how they really are.
No, that's not true, ironically enough. The truth is rarely so cut and dry and is often up for interpretation or discussion. If the truth were immutable and unchanging, then I'm afraid that the entire law profession would cease to exist, as would philosophy, because there's no longer any interpretation of events, merely the objective truth. This is the exact same shit as when someone like Mauler will claim that he can objectively critique a work of art. You can describe what happened, but you can't make any kind of moral or quality judgment, extrapolation or interpretation, because then that's no longer the truth or objectivity or whatever. Several people can have the same interaction or experience and experience it differently based on how they perceive it. My truth is merely saying this is how I interpreted an event. Basically, there is no such thing as a measurement of truth either way.
And how about same-sex marriage? Let's not get into the politics. Let's just look at the language. Throughout history, in every culture, marriage has been the union of husbands, men, and wives, women. Same-sex marriage is the union of men with men or women with women, but it is most certainly not the union of husbands and wives.
Oh no, let's not get into the politics of it, but also it can't be called marriage because I think marriage has to be between a man and a woman and don't understand what the fuck I'm talking about, which is definitely not a political statement. This has been done to death, but this shit has been going on long enough for it not to be a big deal now, so no, actually, marriage does not mean a civil union between a man and a woman. In fact, several cultures throughout history have practiced not only same-sex but also polygamous marriages, including multiple biblical figures. Even so, same-sex unions aren't a recent invention. Just as a single example, until the 13th century, male bonding ceremonies were common in churches across the Mediterranean. Apart from the couple's gender, these events were often indistinguishable from other marriages of the era. 12th century liturgies for same-sex unions, also known as spiritual brotherhoods, included the recital of marriage prayers, the joining of hands at the altar, and a ceremonial kiss. So again, this was an unresearched lie.
Once the phrase same-sex was placed before the word marriage, that is, once the definition of marriage changed, the debate changed. It became about marriage equality. It was suddenly an act of bigotry to limit marriage to husbands and wives.
Yes, because marriage is not exclusive to men and women, and to claim that gay couples don't deserve the same rights or to have the ability to celebrate their relationships in the same way is fucked up. Sorry, but if you want to claim to be the land of the free, you can't keep imposing bullshit restrictions on people.
All this manipulation of language has paid off for the left, because whoever controls the words controls the culture.
This is wild. So the left respect trans people's pronouns, use evidence and facts to inform their opinions, oppose hate speech, and have basic knowledge of science and history, and this means that we're trying to control the culture. Yep, you got us, mate.
Don't believe me? Just try using plain language instead of the left's politically correct jargon.
No one gives a shit about saying Merry Christmas. Sure, Happy Holidays is more inclusive and is less likely to get you into an awkward situation with someone who doesn't celebrate Christmas, but no one's going to deck you if you say Merry Christmas. At most, they'll either correct you and say, actually, I'm Jewish or something, or respond with Happy Holidays. In my experience, it's actually the conservatives who get really mad about Happy Holidays and not the other way around.
But be careful. Use the wrong words, and you might lose your job, your home, and your reputation.
Again, this can happen if the wrong words you use are bigotry or abuse, but that's capitalism for you. If you make your employer look bad, they will fire you without a second thought, regardless of if that's the right, fair, or correct thing to do.
But that's capitalism.
The culture war is largely a war of words. Right now, the left is winning. You can see the consequences everywhere. In politics, in education, in media.
Yes, in politics, which the right are overwhelmingly dominating, in education, which is being underfunded and abused by the right wing, and the media, of which the most popular outlet in the US is Fox News, and in the UK is the Daily Mail and The Sun. Do these headlines seem like they've been affected by the left-wing culture war? Does Tucker Carlson?
We have a moral obligation to admit the world's poor, they tell us, even if it makes our own country poorer and dirtier and more divided.
It's time to fight back. We should not cede another syllable. What's in a word? Everything. I'm Michael Knowles, host of The Michael Knowles Show for Prager University.
The thing about the far right is that everything has to be a world-ending, earth-shattering disaster of epic proportions, which requires a massive pushback to resist, meaning that we end up with videos like this, which is only from 2018 by the way, in which people like this guy can claim without a hint of irony that people saying Happy Holidays is a battleground, that we cannot cede any ground lest we succumb. Are you ready to be confronted by high-level important ideas, fellow cucks? Are you already offended like the snowflakes you are? Ooh, it's the first person I've had to look up this video. What fun! Oh, okay. Actually, it's not as interesting as I'd hoped. He's just a run-of-the-mill dickhead who rose to prominence by failing to understand the purpose and function of trigger warnings, wrote a book accusing college students of being perpetually offended, and apparently describes himself as a liberal despite lending his voice to extreme far-right propaganda outfit PragerU. But as we've discussed many times in this channel, centrists are usually friendly with far-right ideas and people, and free speech absolutism basically means that you have to fall in line with the far right if you want to be taken seriously, so this is no surprise.
Freedom of speech, the ability to express yourself. It's a cherished idea, as well it should be. Most of us who live in liberal Western democracies think of it as a basic human right. People have fought and died for it.
I don't disagree so far, though I would question the idea that the West is the only place with free speech. The question, as with most of these does this offend you people, is how he's defining free speech, because there's a lot of nuance when it comes to this subject, but we'll have to watch and see, I suppose.
But now we may be in danger of losing it. The threat is not coming from without, from external enemies, but from within.
It's really not, but go ahead, justify away.
A generation is being raised not to believe in freedom of speech, but rather that they should have freedom from speech.
This is not true by any stretch, and again we see the word games. I guarantee that if you ask the average millennial or zoomer if they believe in freedom of speech, most of them would say yes. No one is seriously saying that saying shitty things should be banned or that you should be arrested for it or something, but harassment, including bigotry or spreading lies or ideologies that might lead to violence or oppression, maybe shouldn't be encouraged. I do not give a fuck if some weirdo Nazi is going on about the Jews with his mates, but if he does it in a public place, incites hatred against others, and spreads a hateful ideology, then yeah, sorry, maybe that person shouldn't be supported. Maybe not arrested, and maybe not fined, but certainly not supported, and definitely not invited onto campus and paid to speak by the university.
From speech they dislike. This is a threat to both pluralism and democracy itself.
As we discussed in the previous video, this is debatable, and one could easily argue that actually having a bigot come onto campus to spread hate is affecting the freedom of speech of marginalised people, since if they're made to feel unwelcome or like their existence is up for debate, and that their university sees fit to invite a speaker who seeks to publicly invalidate them, well, they're probably not going to be as willing to speak out or be honest in future if they feel like they can't trust the system, their fellow students who supported the move, or the university who thought that allowing a bigot to spread lies about them was more important than their safety. Who would be willing to speak out if they felt unsafe doing so? Not many people.
We see this in Europe, where sensitivity-based censorship attempts to ban anything deemed hateful or even just hurtful, and to ban criticism of religion, especially Islam.
This is not at all true. We have a number of laws restricting incitement to violence, harassment, threats, etc. In the UK, the Public Order Act 1986 prohibits expressions of racial hatred, which is defined as hatred against a group of persons by reason of the group's colour, race, nationality, including citizenship, or ethnic or national origins. Section 18 of the Act says, a person who uses threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviour, or displays any written material which is threatening, abusive, or insulting, is guilty of an offence if A. he intends thereby to stir up racial hatred, or B. having regard to all the circumstances racial hatred is likely to be stirred up thereby. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 inserted Section 4A into the Public Order Act 1986. That part prohibits anyone from causing alarm or distress. Section 4A states, 1. A person is guilty of an offence if, with intent to cause a person harassment, alarm, or distress, they A. use threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviour, or disorderly behaviour, or B. display any writing, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive, or insulting, thereby causing that or another person harassment, alarm, or distress. The Racial and Religious Hatred Act 2006 amended the Public Order Act 1986 by adding Part 3A, which reads, a person who uses threatening words or behaviour or displays any written material which is threatening is guilty of an offence if he intends to thereby stir up religious hatred. It also protects freedom of expression by stating in Section 29J, nothing in this part shall be read or given effect in any way which prohibits or restricts discussion, criticism, or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult, or abuse abuse of a particular religions on the beliefs or practices of their adherents, or of any other belief system or the beliefs or practices of its adherents, or proselytizing or urging adherents of a different religion or belief system to cease practicing their religion or belief system. The Criminal Justice and Immigration Act 2008 amended Part 3A of the Public Order Act 1986. The amended Part 3A adds, for England and Wales, the offence of inciting hatred on the grounds of sexual orientation. All the offences in Part 3 attach to the following acts: the use of words of behaviour as display of written material, publish or distributing written material, the public performance of a play, distributing, showing or playing a recording, broadcasting or including a programme in a programme service, and possession of inflammatory material. In the circumstances of hatred based on religious belief or on sexual orientation, the relevant act, namely words, behaviour, written material or recordings or programme, must be threatening and not just abusive or insulting. Likewise, the 2010 Equality Act sets out legal protections for workers and renters who have what is referred to as protected characteristics, including but not limited to race, sexuality, disability and gender identity and expression. I know it may be difficult, this is PragerU after all, but please stop lying.
But the United States, despite its strong constitutional protections in the Bill of Rights, is far from immune from the rising trend of suppression of speech, or what is sometimes called political correctness.
Political correctness is not anything to do with the Bill of Rights or the First Amendment or whatever. There is no political correctness law, nor is there any obligation for anyone to be politically correct 100% of the time, but let's be honest here, when someone on the right whines about political correctness like this, what they're actually doing is crying over being called out for being a bigot. A more accurate term for political correctness might be treating people with respect and dignity, something which the right find impossible to do, which is why they hate it so much.
This is especially true at America's colleges and universities, the place where our future leaders are educated and where you'd expect speech to be the most free.
Not going to really comment on the assumption that a leader has to be university educated, considering that the whole point is ostensibly that anyone, even someone working class, can be president someday, but now it's only if they're able to afford to go to college apparently, otherwise they can fuck off. The question is, do I expect there to be more free speech on university campuses? And the answer to that is that I don't care. Surely it should just be reflective of wider society. Also, presumably there are many rules specific to universities that don't apply in the workplace. For example,
highly restrictive speech codes are now the norm on campus, not the exception. According to a study by my organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, 54% of public universities and 59% of private universities impose politically correct speech codes on their students.
Please, explain why this is a bad thing. This really isn't explained or elaborated upon, and I feel like politically correct speech codes is a term for which we really kind of need a solid definition before we can either accept or critique it. Having looked it up, it appears that FIRE has a rating system in which it rates universities green, yellow, or red based on their apparent freedom of speech. The example they give of a university unacceptably infringing upon students' First Amendment rights is requiring a university login in order to view university free speech policies, and a yellow light would simply be using vague language within the policy description. So when he brings up these big charts and says, these colleges impose politically correct free speech codes, what he actually means is some universities are too vague and others require students to use their student login in order to access the policies.
And thanks to recent Department of Education guidelines, 100% of colleges may adopt speech codes in the coming years.
Again, this is obvious scaremongering, but without a definition or example, basically all he's saying is undefined bad things might happen if you don't listen to me. Honestly, what negative effect does this have? Even if 100% of colleges use vague wording on their speech policies, why is this bad? It very well might be, but no explanation is provided.
How bad is it? At a public campus in California on Constitution Day in 2013, a student who also happens to be a decorated military veteran was told he could not hand out copies of the Constitution to his fellow students. The objection from the university was not ideological. It was out of control bureaucracy imposing limits on speech.
I looked this up and it looks like this was just a fuck up on the part of the university. From the Politico article about the incident, after the incident, Modesto Junior College President Jill Stearns issued a statement saying the school apologized to the student and was working to clarify with campus officials that policies allow students to distribute printed material as long as it does not disrupt the orderly operation of the college. Stearns also said that the school was reviewing its policies. The statement also said that the school wholly supports free speech and Constitution Day activities, and decried that discussion about the event devolved into attacks that included staff staff being called morons, idiots, whores, and Nazis, and death threats. So, not an example of free speech policy going wrong, merely a mistake on the part of the university. A pretty big and rather ironic mistake given the circumstances, but not really an incident you can use to extrapolate out to smear all colleges in the country, right? He then goes on to make the same point about various other isolated incidents, which, yeah, a lot of them are pretty stupid mistakes and policies, and they definitely should have been dealt with better, but like, you're not exactly demonstrating a pattern, you know? He provides 3 examples and leaves it at that.
Recently, students and sympathetic faculty have joined forces to exclude campus speakers whose opinions they dislike.
No, they band together to try to exclude speakers who express bigotry, participate in harassment, incite violence, and spread hatred to impressionable young minds. It's not run-of-the-mill conservatives being protested, is it now? It's the extreme far-right bigoted ones with the massive Nazi followings. Andrew Neil isn't being banned from campuses, but Milo Yiannopoulos is.
At FIRE, we call this disinvitation season.
And at Sheep in the Box, we call this not wanting to make your students feel unsafe by inviting, endorsing, and paying for a bigot to come on campus and tell everyone how dangerous, invalid, and disgusting marginalised people are. Jordan Peterson is not owed a career giving talks in which he cries about trans activism causing the fall of the West, and if the students protest, the university will likely cave because the students' tuition fees keep the lights on and they don't want the bad PR. That's not a problem of political correctness, it's a problem of capitalism and a system in which universities rely on tuition fees. So long as tuition fees exist, the students are customers and the customer is always right. Right?
But that's capitalism.
Although the season lasts all year round.
It's not a season then, is it? Maybe you should come up with a better name.
Since 2009, there has been a major uptick in the push by students and faculty to get speakers they dislike disinvited.
It's not just speakers they dislike though, it's hateful speakers, bigoted speakers, speakers who base a career around stoking hatred. Jordan Peterson lectures were never protested when he was lecturing on psychiatry, aka the one subject on which he actually does know what he's fucking talking about, were they? It just coincidentally happened to be when he started going on about his unhinged Western supremacy bollocks. Why do people protest when Stefan Molyneux is invited onto campus? Could it be his history of white nationalism, factually inaccurate statements about how black people are inherently less intelligent than white people because they have smaller brains and weird obsession with young women's fertility? It's a mystery.
Protect the eggs! 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 Protect the eggs!
These speakers have included former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, the Somali-born feminist and critic of Islam, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and the director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde. And that's only the obvious part of the disinvitation problem.
Condoleezza Rice was partially responsible for the legitimization of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques being used on terror suspects during the Iraq War. We covered Ayaan Hirsi Ali in the last episode of this series, but just a reminder, she has a history of making bigoted statements about Islam and also specific Muslims, which some deemed hate speech, and has been declared an anti-Muslim extremist by the Southern Poverty Law Center following some particularly spicy comments. As director of the IMF, Lagarde should expect to be hated in much of the world either way, but she was disgraced shortly after the Greek financial crisis, in which she accused the Greeks of failing to pay taxes, referred to the financial crisis by saying that Greeks had had a nice time, but now it is payback time, conflating the rich with people living in abject poverty as a result of the crisis. She then went on to compile a list of those she believed were the biggest tax avoiders, and then had a journalist who published it arrested, all the time whilst raking in a tax-free $500,000 a year pension. Oh, and also in 2016 she was declared guilty of criminal negligence in overlooking a €403 million arbitration deal in favour of a rich businessman and possible acquaintance of hers.
Few conservative speakers are invited to speak at colleges lest they have to be disinvited later.
This, again, is a problem both of capitalism and the fact that conservatives in general tend to be more bigoted and throw a lot more hate speech around. I have yet to see any popular figure on the left claim that black people are genetically inferior, but it's surprisingly common on the right. I wonder why. Could bigotry be an inherent part of the ideology? Surely not.
The newest threat to speech comes from so-called trigger warnings. Alerts that warn students that they are about to read or hear something that triggers a negative emotional response.
Okay, so we covered this briefly earlier in the video, but before we get into this section, this is not exactly what a trigger warning is, so I'll just provide the actual clinical, psychological definition of a trigger warning before we get into the meat of this section. Trigger warnings are put in place to help sufferers of PTSD and similar conditions who have trauma triggers that may cause severe distress and or mental harm, and to inform these people that a work contains writing, images or concepts that may set off these trauma triggers. The term and concept originated in academia, was then adopted by several feminist websites that were discussing violence against women, and then spread to other areas. You know that old stereotype of Vietnam veterans losing their shit over fireworks and stuff, or the trope of Vietnam flashbacks, which were usually played for laughs in old sitcoms? Yeah, that's a trauma trigger. As I mentioned earlier, think of a trigger warning like those warnings you get at the beginning of movies, which let you know that the movie is going to contain flashing lights, but for people who suffer from PTSD, not seizures.
A 2014 New York Times article cited the example of a Rutgers student requesting trigger warnings for the classic American novel The Great Gatsby because it, quote, possesses a variety of scenes that reference abusive, misogynistic violence, unquote.
This is a perfect example of a work that might cause a trauma trigger in a student who had no idea what the novel would contain. If said student is a victim of abusive misogynistic violence, this can very well cause a lot of severe PTSD related issues, and putting a little note at the beginning letting the reader know about it is just a kind of decent thing to do, you know?
Recently, Oberlin College attempted to institute a policy that heavily encouraged the faculty to avoid difficult topics and to employ trigger warnings as a means of making classrooms safer.
Yes, how dare they want to protect their students and help those of them suffering from mental illness feel safe. This is a good compromise, in my opinion. Say up front the topic of discussion and let the students make their own decisions on whether or not those topics may be trauma triggers before engaging in it.
Safety has been watered down to essentially mean the right to always feel comfortable.
No, safety has in this case been used to mean wanting to avoid causing students having PTSD breakdowns if at all possible. Look, it's clear that you don't understand what trigger warnings are, which is interesting because PragerU are big fans of the troops, who often suffer from PTSD and therefore will likely have various trauma triggers. And are our brave, patriotic soldiers just easily offended snowflakes who don't like to be put outside their comfort zone? According to PragerU, yes.
New demands for trigger warnings are popping up on campuses across the country.
Good. That at least implies that universities are starting to acknowledge the difficulties of living with PTSD and are helping to accommodate students suffering from it.
Add in popular academic theories that encourage students to scrutinize speech for microaggressions, any statement that might be construed as racially insensitive, classist, sexist, or otherwise un-PC.
Microaggressions are a thing, but notice that he says popular academic theories here, rather than citing any examples of institutions or organisations actually implementing a policy based on those theories, because that hasn't happened, so he's now just getting mad at peer-reviewed academic theory in general, rather than anything to do with free speech.
And it's clear that campuses are teaching students to police what they say.
I mean, maybe in the sense that they try to curb bigotry, harassment and hate speech, but no, apparently we need more of that stuff.
This is precisely the opposite of what is needed. Our society needs candor, and it needs freedom of speech, not freedom from speech. Intellectual comfort is not a right, nor should it ever be. Not if we want freedom of speech. Let's just call it freedom to survive.
This coming from a right-winger. Oh, I'm sorry, a liberal. He's a right-winger. The right lose their shit every time they're confronted with scientific literature proving that trans people are valid, climate change is real, or trickle-down economics doesn't and has never worked, and yet they still feel they have the right to accuse the left of demanding intellectual comfort rather than being challenged in any way. Wild.
I'm Greg Lukianoff, president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education for Prager University.
I was hoping he'd also have a go at what he reckons safe spaces are, because that's another idea these people seem to be trying desperately hard to misunderstand. Oh well, we've got a cracker up next. I'll let you in on a little secret here. This is actually going to be the second PragerU video I ever made, because this video I'm about to show you is so incredibly wrong and came out like a week after my first video. Are you ready to be dazzled by lies and blown away by defensiveness? I do hope so.
You are looking at a dangerous person. You may feel unsafe, even threatened by my very existence. What is this power I possess? It's called free speech.
She's not dangerous, she's a dickhead, and when she says free speech, what she actually means is invalidating and casting doubt on the honesty of women talking about their sexual assault.
While I knew it was always there, I recently discovered its true value.
The true value of free speech apparently is being able to play the victim on various right-wing propaganda outlets whilst raking in that sweet, sweet cash.
Here's my story. It could easily be yours. I'm a journalist, an author, and a podcaster. I live in Portland, Oregon. My husband owns a few local coffee shops and a small coffee roasting business called Ristretto Roasters. In December 2018, I started a YouTube podcast entitled #MeNeither.
This is all build up for the pity party later on, so I'm not going to comment on it, but let's be honest here, your reactionary podcast is called #MeNeither, so the title alone implies a certain level of derision for the Me Too movement, in which numerous women in the movie industry and elsewhere spoke out about their experiences with sexual harassment and assault. Even ignoring the content for a moment, you deliberately made sure to call your podcast something inflammatory in order to drum up controversy, so why were you upset when controversy was successfully drummed up?
The show's About page reads, Me Neither is an almost weekly conversation about the cultural issues of the day and an attempt to create a space where people can find ways to think out loud through uncomfortable topics.
Okay, but you wrote that About page though. It's not going to be an accurate description of the show by any stretch. An About page on YouTube is basically just a Twitter bio. It's how you want to describe the show, not an objective description.
One of those topics is the Me Too movement and what I see as some of its excesses, including celebrities who exploit Me Too for personal gain.
Alright, and those people are pretty shitty, but that's not all you do, is it? In fact, as Oregon Live, an outlet for which you used to write, ironically enough, put it, in the first #MeNeither episode, Rommelman and McSweeney called into question the motives and trustworthiness of Asia Argento and Rose McGowan, two actors who accused Harvey Weinstein of sexual harassment and assault in 2017. Rommelman mocks Argento's Italian accent and calls Rose McGowan a fabulist from way back. I frankly don't care if someone wants to go and have sex because they might get a better part, Rommelman says. I don't care. That's their decision. McSweeney also questions Argento's role in her boyfriend Anthony Bourdain's suicide, something she also discussed in a now taken down comment for Penthouse called Hotlines Can We Talk About Toxic Femininity. I saw what was going on and I was wondering why no one was honestly covering it, like why the media was acting like she was a grieving widow when really she wasn't at all, McSweeney says in the first episode of Me Neither. Which not to say that that's all her fault, this and that, but if she cheated 2 days before he died and the pictures were everywhere and then we're gonna act like we don't know why he died, so rather than criticising celebrities who exploit Me Too for personal gain, what Rommelman actually means here is accusing sexual assault victims of lying, using sex in order to further their careers, and also blaming them for their partner's suicide.
Sexual assault and harassment are real, but the idea that any charge any woman or man brings must be believed without question, where's the logic in that?
No one is saying this. What we mean when we say believe sexual assault survivors is not believe them 100% of the time whatever they say, we mean take their accusations seriously and don't just brush them off. Likewise, if someone like Weinstein being credibly accused by a fuck ton of women all with similar stories, well, maybe that's worthy of further investigation?
I believe we are better off judging any claim of harassment, like any other claim, on its own merits. This, I would learn, is not a popular position.
No, what you believe in is accusing victims of sexual assault and or harassment of lying and also directly leading to their partner's death.
It turned out one of the people tuning into my new show was a former employee of my husband's coffee business. She claimed my views were vile, dangerous, and extremely misguided.
And she was correct to claim that because they are.
And in an email to the press, claimed my opinions created a demoralizing and hostile environment for employees.
Again, I don't see how this can be disputed. The boss's wife, who actually has a lot of involvement within the company, certainly more than she lets on, but more on that in a moment, arguably implied, by her silence and lack of disagreement with her co-host on or off air, that sexual harassment victims are lying sluts who use their sexuality to get fame and make xenophobic comments about their nationality. So let's say you're an employee of this business. The boss's wife, who the boss has stood by and refused to condemn her words, said that we should automatically doubt sexual assault survivors, blame them for loved one's suicide, and that it's far more likely that women would sleep with their boss to get ahead at work rather than victims of harassment and assault telling the truth, because, I mean, come on now, rich powerful men being predators who take advantage of those over whom they have power, unheard of! And you're working here, seeing this play out and suddenly becoming aware that if your manager or even your boss or one of your co-workers harasses or assaults you, your boss, who again has yet to disagree with anything his wife said, is likely to take your attacker's position over yours because you are probably just fucking him to get a promotion to assistant manager, right? And if your heritage is not American, well, he also apparently stands by xenophobia, so that's fun too. She does Italian accents. I wonder if she also does Indian, for example. Or how about if you have a loved one who recently committed suicide? One of the most common issues of those left behind after a suicide suffered through is an irrational fear and misplaced guilt that they're to blame, that they could have done more, and so on. And so is it too far of a stretch to assume that your boss also believes that you're to blame for that loved one's suicide? Yeah, you know what? I can imagine that would make for a demoralizing and hostile work environment, not gonna lie.
Why would the opinions of the wife of the boss demoralize an employee? no one bothered to ask that question.
Okay, so let's discuss this, shall we? Referring again to Oregon Live, who really don't seem to like their former contributor for some reason. I wonder why, she seems delightful. State records list her as the manager of Ristretto. Over email Thursday, Johnson, Rommelman's husband, called these records outdated and in need of updating, and said Rommelman helped with baking and other back-end housekeeping when the business first opened, but Nancy has not for years worked with Ristretto or been on payroll. Other pieces of evidence point to Rommelman's ongoing involvement with the company, however. Oregon Liquor Control Commission spokesman Matthew Van Sickle confirmed Friday that Rommelman was listed on a liquor license for Ristretto from June 21st, 2013 to December 31st, 2015, and an email provided to the Oregonian Live by a former employee sent by Rommelman on May 16, 2018 to Ristretto employees about the closing of the coffee shop's Southwest Broadway location shows just how involved Rommelman was in the business as recently as 2018. As some of you may know, we're closing the cafe at 1320 Broadway today, the email said. When we signed on as tenant, it continues, it was with the understanding from the building developers that Ristretto would be part of a retail community situated in and on either side of the lobby, including restaurants and other businesses. The email is signed Nancy and Din. Also, I just wanted to point out that it wasn't just one employee or even a couple of employees who said this, but one letter written by a single employee that was signed by 30 current and former employees. According to Rommelman, her husband's coffee chain consists of 3 branches. How big a percentage of the workforce is that? I would wager quite a large chunk.
That I appeared to be on the wrong side of the Me Too debate was all people needed to know. By the time you could say Twitter, a social media mob formed to say they would never spend another penny at my husband's business.
Good. I honestly don't see the problem here. This business has shown itself to be uncaring about employees. One of the bosses has made light of suicide, xenophobia and sexual assault, and there has been no apology, so sorry, but I completely understand the boycott here. Aren't boycotts also free speech, or are they only good when you're not the recipient of one?
A college-age girl stormed into one of the cafes, screaming, variously, that the baristas were in danger and that their working at the cafe posed a threat to the community. Employees previously secure in their jobs grew jittery and quit.
I don't give a shit about one single woman coming into the store to cause an issue. I used to work in a similar job and we had people come in and try to cause shit all the time. And one time an elderly woman just did a shit and I had to clean it up. Is it not more likely that your employees saw the horrendous things you'd said and, as I just mentioned, no longer felt safe or comfortable continuing to work for you? Also, you say they're insecure in their jobs now, but let's be honest here, places like this usually don't provide full-time hours on a rota that can change at any time, requires working weekends and definitely don't pay a living wage, and because this is the US, of course they likely pay dog shit and expect the rest to be made up in tips, so even if it wasn't because of all this shite, maybe it was just a shitty job. But don't just take my word for it, here's what the jobs section of the Ristretto Roasters website has to say. Ristretto Roasters is always accepting applications for hardworking and skilled baristas to fill part-time and full-time positions at cafe locations. Positions will be between 2 to 4 shifts per week, require flexibility and weekend availability. Compensation is hourly plus tips. Always accepting applications to me implies high turnover. 2 to 4 shifts a week including requiring flexibility just means not enough hours to really get by and definitely no regular shifts, and as I said, hourly plus tips means we will pay you peanuts. Also, here's a summary of the aforementioned letter signed by employees. We believe it is a business owner's responsibility to create a safe and supportive working environment for their employees, reads the letter. Invalidating assault survivors throws into question the safety of Ristretto Roasters as a workplace and has the potential to create a demoralizing and hostile environment for employees and customers alike. This cannot be tolerated. It is important for customers to be informed about the ideology Rommelman is promoting, Camilla Cadu, who sent out the letter on behalf of the employees, said Thursday. Cadu worked for Ristretto for 5 years, 3 of which she was operations manager. She said she worked closely with Rommelman at Ristretto during that time. Cadu said that whilst the current and former employees wanted to make sure the public is aware of Rommelman's YouTube show, they also want customers to know that they don't support the content of that show.
One suggested that my husband sell the company and that I offer a public apology before it was too late. This all happened within the first 48 hours.
Okay, so within the first 48 hours, a few randos on Twitter said they'd boycott the coffee place, one person came in and started making a scene, and a couple of people quit in an industry with an insanely high turnover rate. Oh, and an employee politely suggested that you issue an apology for the shitty things you said. The one about selling the company is obviously pretty dumb, but one person saying a dumb thing doesn't make it a pattern.
As the outrage grew, local businesses that make up a big part of my husband's base cut and run. Wholesale customers canceled large accounts, afraid they'd be caught in the Me Too crossfire.
Or maybe they also took a moral stand against you, but even if this assumption was accurate, this is a fault of capitalism, not freedom of speech. They see a potential reduction in profits by continuing to support you, so they stopped doing so.
But that's capitalism.
Also, just because you have the freedom to say awful, potentially libelous things about people doesn't mean that you have the right to not be criticised for doing so, because that would restrict the rights of others to express their speech by, for example, boycotting your business, going to the press, co-signing a letter criticising you, walking into a store and making a scene, or making shitty comments about selling the business. Or is it only your free speech that you want to protect, not the free speech of people criticising you? How many times do these people fail to understand that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom of consequences? For fuck's sake, we just had a guy complaining about people wanting to be protected from criticism or being made uncomfortable, and now we have someone wanting exactly that.
Staff now worried that they'd lose their jobs and health insurance if Ristretto were forced to close. That I, a person with whom they'd heretofore had a perfectly congenial relationship, might in fact be a secret monster, a rape culture apologist.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to comment on the job losses because this is your fault here. You chose to say those offensive things on a podcast the title of which makes deliberately inflammatory statement in full knowledge of your connection to your husband's business on the internet of all places where it's very difficult to escape criticism, but you implied that sexual assault victims are liars who are responsible for their loved one's suicide. I'd call that pretty monstrous behaviour, and all whining about it on PragerU does is make you seem like not only a monster, but one who's desperate for people to like them. Here's your choice. Either don't say or do awful things, or accept that some people might think that you're an awful person for doing so. No one knows who you are on the inside, so all we can do is judge by your actions, which don't exactly paint you in a flattering light. You make excuses for rape culture, demonize those who come forward about being sexually assaulted, claim that they're lying for clout, and then say that they're probably just sluts who wanted to get a promotion anyway. I'm not going to call you a rape culture apologist, but I completely understand why some might.
Many of those who claimed to have been offended had not seen the podcast. One woman wrote, "I clicked, downvoted, then reported on YouTube that it violates community guidelines. Hateful. I didn't listen, but it's one way to make that expletive go away."
Yeah, this is just YouTube comments. This happens to all of us, especially if we make political content. People will click on a video, downvote it, call you a cuck, and then leave. This isn't unique to you or your situation. There's a reason "don't read the comments" is a common meme on YouTube. It's okay for people like me because I can moderate my comments and curate a less toxic place for discussions to happen, but I do sometimes feel for larger creators who get far too many comments for this to be manageable. Also, based on what I've seen, in all likelihood, the shit you said on your podcast actually did violate community guidelines, which is presumably why you set all your content to private.
This kind of uninformed virtual attack strikes me as childish. The behavior of a toddler whose tantrum brings a dinner party to a halt until it's placated with the attention it seeks.
Yeah, I'm not going to defend abusive YouTube commenters, but I think it's a bit rich of you to deliberately make inflammatory and offensive content designed to drum up controversy and then accuse people of reacting to this inflammatory behaviour as being childish and looking for attention, when that was the entire point of your podcast, to get as much attention as possible by acting out.
I invited my critics to speak with me. The whole point of Me Neither is to provoke discussion. No one took me up on my offer.
Debate me, debate me, debate me. Enter the ring of logic and reason. If I don't know what I'm talking about and you point that out, that's an ad hominem, baby. Your argument's been demolished.
If I say something heinous and that makes you angry,
That's an emotional argument, and I win.
you're going up against the titan of the mind. So you don't want a free exchange of ideas?
Isn't that what society's all about? You're never gonna change my mind, but a bunch of dumbasses online will think I won. Why don't you want to debate? Please debate me. Oh, come on, please debate me.
No one is obligated to debate you or discuss your opinions, especially when they're so heinous. Your critics refusing to debate an idiot and saying that there's no point trying to convince someone so mind-bogglingly ignorant doesn't mean that you win, I'm afraid. It just means that people don't see a point in engaging with you.
It was evidently easier for so-called feminists to tell my husband to leave his wife or lose his business.
I genuinely don't know what the so-called feminists bit here is. People taking the side of sexual assault and or harassment survivors over some woman online who reckons they're lying for no reason doesn't make them not real feminists, it just makes them feminists who think you're a bit of a cunt, which, you know, fair. Okay, just gonna skip a whole section here where she goes on about people messaging her shitty things on Facebook, which again is fucked up and I condemn. Harassment is never good, but on the other hand, it does raise an interesting question. If her saying offensive things online, potentially causing backlash towards those people she slandered, is free speech, but people getting mad at sending shitty Facebook messages is not free speech, well, where's the line? I thought that free speech was absolute to these people.
It's also contrary to what is most fundamental to America, that every citizen has the equal right to voice his or her opinion and to express these opinions in a public forum.
First off, the First Amendment just means that you can't be arrested for your speech, not that other people can't use their free speech to criticize or attack you. Likewise, those social media platforms are not public forums, they're private businesses, and if they believe that banning certain kinds of speech will affect their bottom line, then yeah, sorry, that's capitalism again, not your free speech being attacked.
My story is one of many, another cautionary tale for those who get pulled into the culture wars. I understand why most people want to stay out of it. It's scary to fight for liberty and against a mob. The whole thing is exhausting.
Oh yes, that's why you slandered sexual assault victims, accused them of lying, sleeping with their attacker to get ahead, blamed them for their partner's suicide, and then also mocked their nationality for good measure. You were fighting for liberty, of course. Weird how often fighting for liberty and being a dickhead look like basically the same thing.
I've repeatedly been asked, usually in "you should have known better" tones, if I'm going to stop having nuanced conversations about sensitive subjects. The answer is absolutely not. And if that makes you feel unsafe, too bad. I'm Nancy Rommelman, journalist and author for Prager University.
Interesting, because you set all your YouTube videos to private and you haven't made any podcasts since February 2019. If you are someone who is passionate about having nuanced conversations about sensitive subjects, why would you do that? But anyway. PragerU doesn't understand free speech. How big of a deal is that? Well, they've recently decided to completely embarrass themselves by suing Google and making so many videos about said lawsuit that honestly I was going to cover one of them here, but is it even worth it? May as well wait for them to make 5 and make another one of these videos specifically about it. They genuinely don't seem to understand the difference between a public forum and a private platform, and apparently they have a whole legal team who also don't understand it. Weird. Anyway, that's not what we're going to finish up with today. Now, see, PragerU, like all right-wingers, have a really big problem with trans people existing, but don't like to say that, so they tend to attack them around the periphery by stopping them using the bathroom they identify with, claim that they're just confused or mentally ill, and then play the victim when deliberately misgendering someone because calling out bigotry is attacking free speech. You may recognise this as one of the main reasons Jordan Peterson first rose to prominence, because he made a whole thing about the state forcing him to respect his students being literally Maoist China or something. PragerU, of course, are about to make a similar claim here, though they missed out on the opportunity to call this video preferred pronouns or gulag, which is unfortunate.
If you want to control people's thoughts, begin by controlling their words. That's totalitarian thinking. It was once completely foreign to America. Not anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like at any point in US history saying the wrong words could get you arrested or interrogated for potential connections to communism, or being brave enough to speak certain words freely might result in you being thrown in prison or the CIA hunting you down so you have to hide in Russia for the rest of your life. Or how about the way that Americans like to whitewash certain incidents by using more flowery language to mask the atrocities, and those who refuse to do so receive severe backlash. Oh yeah, Thanksgiving is a symbol of the native people and white settlers coming together and living in harmony like they definitely did, rather than the truth, which is the carrying out of a genocide. Prison labour is rarely referred to as literal slavery, and the wars in the Middle East are just an example of America spreading freedom, right? Or how about the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it an imprisonable offence to criticise the federal government or US military involvement in World War I? Is that not part of American history? Weird how all these things are ignored, but this lady definitely knows what she's talking about and isn't a lying fucking dickhead.
Increasingly, Americans are forced to use language against their will or even their conscience, or be prepared to suffer the consequences.
Of course, we know where this is going based on the title of the video, but holy shit, the lengths to which conservatives will go to engage in bigotry and then play the victim when people call them out on it. Impressive. I know it's not really the same thing, but do you think that they call black people the N-word, then act like they're the victim when someone calls them a racist? Oh, who am I kidding? Of course they do.
And those consequences can be dire.
Oh no, not consequences! How terrible! As a rich conservative white lady, I should be immune to those.
Take, for example, the issue of transgenderism, the newest civil rights battle of our time. A decade ago, few people could even tell you what the word transgender meant. Today, expressing the wrong opinion on the issue can cost you your business, or job, or both.
There are two things going on here. First, the assertion that ignorance is an excuse for bigotry, which it isn't. All people are racist as fuck, but I for one have never been shy of calling them out on it. They don't get to just get away with that shit because things were different back in their day. And likewise, the fact that people get pissed off when you say shitty things isn't the same as censorship, and certainly not authoritarianism, as you mentioned earlier, because it's not the government doing this, so it's at best society not liking bigots, which is probably only an issue if you are one. And secondly, whilst people can be let go from jobs due to bigotry, putting the company in a bad light, and or potentially affecting their bottom line, which, as I've repeatedly mentioned throughout this video, is an issue of capitalism, not free speech.
That's capitalism.
So long as it doesn't affect your employer or turn into workplace harassment or bullying, it's extremely unlikely. Further, whilst this can happen, it's extremely rare. However, losing your job or business due to being trans is significantly more common, and in fact most of these laws she's going to go on to whine about are put in place as a reaction to the widespread practice of anti-trans discrimination employers and landlords often engage in.
Consider recent state and local actions punishing those who decline to use an individual's pronouns of choice.
Trans people want to be treated as valid, and there is significant evidence to show that being misgendered can have serious negative effects on a trans person's mental health. A recent study published in the Journal of Adolescent Health, for example, link in the description, demonstrates the power of affirming transgender youth's identities. For each additional context, i.e. at home, school, work, or with friends, in which a transgender person's chosen name is used, their risk of suicidal behaviour is reduced by more than half. Or to put it another way, continuing to misgender someone can potentially increase their chances of committing suicide by more than double. I don't know about you, but I'm more concerned about the safety and well-being of vulnerable kids than some old conservatives getting triggered over having to treat others with respect for once.
In 2017, California Governor Jerry Brown signed legislation threatening jail time for healthcare professionals who willfully and repeatedly refuse to use a patient's preferred pronouns.
Yes, otherwise known as harassment of a person with a protected characteristic, in this case gender identity, but even without that in mind, this isn't even fucking true. In fact, as PolitiFact put it, we found groups such as Breitbart and Fox News crammed misleading information into short news headlines, greatly distorting the facts about the use of pronouns or leaving out key information that would have given a different impression, but we also found an element of truth. Violations of the bill could, under limited circumstances, be treated as a misdemeanor, with punishment of up to 1 year in jail and or a $1,000 fine. Courtney Jocelyn, a US Davis law professor, said the bar for criminal prosecution would be extremely high. The bill is very, very clear that what is prohibited is the willful engagement and repeated engagement in discriminatory conduct. So, if someone does make a mistake or doesn't know what a person's gender identity is and uses the incorrect pronouns, that is not a violation of the statute, Jocelyn said. Willful and repeated violations alone wouldn't lead to criminal prosecution, Jocelyn added. They would likely be punished with a fine. Criminal charges would only follow, she said, if the violation reached a level that was shown to cause the risk of death or serious physical harm in accordance with states' existing penalty structure for health and safety code violations. Weiner, the author of the bill, has said purposefully using the wrong pronoun could be treated the same way as someone who violates a centre smoking ban, and it would be considered a minor violation, but no one is going to jail for that. Facilities that fail to comply would most likely get a notice of violation akin to a parking ticket, the senator said in an interview with PolitiFact California. He added that the provisions apply only to care facility staff, not to residents. Honestly, this is impressively deceptive. Well done, PragerU, for sinking to a level most people barely even knew existed.
Under guidelines issued in 2015 by New York City's Commission on Human Rights, employers, landlords, and business owners who intentionally use the wrong pronoun with transgender workers and tenants face potential fines of as much as $250,000.
Yes, notice the use of the word intentional there. They're weaponizing pronouns as a means to harm, harass, and victimize an already vulnerable person in the same way one might attack, victimize, or bully a person of color, disabled person, and so on. These bills exist to protect people who often suffer from discrimination and provide them with a method of asserting themselves and their rights. This woman is basically just saying, why don't those minorities just shut up and take the abuse? And acting like the people harassing a marginalized person are the victims in this situation, we've gone way beyond pretending that this is about people accidentally getting the pronouns wrong or not understanding trans issues, and now she's just defending people who deliberately and maliciously attempt to harm others. Sorry, but discriminatory landlords and employers are not the good guys in this situation.
That's a steep price for saying he instead of she, or she instead of he, or even he or she instead of they.
Honestly, nowadays people can be fined for calling a black person a racial slur. That's a steep fine to pay for saying the N-word instead of sir. Honestly, seriously, how do these people not recognize how they come across? How do you mistreat another human being and then get offended when they react?
What about the vast majority of citizens who hold the biology-based view that chromosomes determine your sex, male or female?
Chromosomes do determine your sex, most of the time, intersex rights after all, but we're not talking about sex here, we're talking about gender, which all the relevant scientific literature suggests is not binary, and is much more fluid than previously thought. But even ignore that for a moment, sex isn't a binary either. As I discussed in my intersex rights video, much like gender is bimodal, and intersex people, as well as people with other genetic defects that leave them with non-standard chromosomes, exist, and they totally ruin this idea of the binary. If you acknowledge the existence of gingers, you necessarily have to acknowledge intersex people because they're approximately as common as one another. But regardless, either this lady is completely ignorant of the scientific facts that not only are sex and gender far from the same thing, but also that sex isn't even that easily separated into male and female, no exceptions. In fact, I did make a whole 22-minute video covering all the difficulties that intersex people do often face in our society. Or she's actively lying, which is fun.
Or those who have a deep-seated religious conviction that sex is both biological and binary, God's purposeful creation.
Fuck them. Sorry, I sincerely doubt that there's a quote from the Bible or Torah that says, "And God said to Moses, there are only two genders, and also facts don't care about your feelings, you bearded cuck LMAO."
These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings.
But I could be wrong. Even if such a quote did exist though, I still wouldn't care. Throughout history, religion has been used to justify racial segregation, chattel slavery, and repression of just about every minority group, so forgive me if I don't agree that this is a compelling argument. You can cherry pick a few Bible quotes to support your point of view if you want. In fact, people like the West Baptist Church have been doing it for decades, but that's not a real argument, and I don't want to get into theological debate where I smugly point out that there are a ton of things modern day Christians do that go against the teachings of God, like mixing fabrics and eating shellfish and so on. Point is, that's usually not what the Holy Text actually says, and even if it did, it's still not an excuse to be a bigot.
In December of 2018, Peter Vlaming was fired from his job as a French language teacher in a Virginia school district because he refused to refer to a transgender student by the student's preferred pronouns. Vlaming's Christian belief prevented him from bowing before the notion that the student who had been a she in his class the year before was now suddenly a he. Vlaming was willing to use the student's chosen new name, but he avoided using any pronouns when referring to this student. That wasn't good enough for the school district. They needed to hear him say the words.
That's PragerU's version of events. Now let's hear it from an actual news source. The French teacher was fired in December 2018, having told superiors at West Point High School his religion prevented him from using male pronouns for a student who had informed the school of his transition during the previous summer. According to Vlaming, in October 2018, the student approached the teacher and said, "Mr. Vlaming, you may have your religion, but you need to respect who I am." Vlaming says he replied, "I'm sorry, this is difficult." His lawsuit says he reported the exchange to the principal, who told him, "You know what you do to diffuse a situation like that? You say, 'I'm sorry, I meant to say him.'" Principal Jonathan Hockman later told a school board meeting, considering whether to fly Vlaming, he could not think of a worse way to treat a child than what was happening. After Vlaming was fired, the West Point school superintendent, Laura Abel, said, "Discrimination leads to creating a hostile learning environment, and the student had expressed that. The parent had expressed that. They felt disrespected." In his lawsuit, Vlaming said that his rights to speak freely and exercise his religion were violated. The suit states that Vlaming seriously believes that referring to a female as a male by using an objectively male pronoun is telling a lie. He is being represented by the Alliance Defending Freedom, an Arizona-based group which the Southern Poverty Law Center watchdog has called one of the most influential groups informing the Trump administration's attacks on LGBTQ+ rights. Not quite as you described it.
You don't have to be religious to believe that one person can never be a they. The Supreme Court has clearly decided that compelled speech is not free speech. In West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the Supreme Court upheld the student's right to refuse to salute an American flag. Justice Robert Jackson wrote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, religion, or other matters of opinion." And, Jackson went on to say, the state can't force people to say things they don't believe. But this is precisely what's happening.
Sure, but that's not what's happening here. It's actually not illegal to say, "I don't think that trans people are valid." Sure, it's stupid, incorrect, and makes no sense, but harassment is not protected in the same way political views are. This really shouldn't be this difficult to understand, but the only way PragerU can come out looking like the good guys here is by conflating two entirely distinct issues and ignore context, so that's what they do, I guess.
People are forced to refer to others as they, or co, or thon. Yes, those are now considered pronouns.
Neopronouns are a whole thing, and I'm really not sure what to think about them due to a lack of knowledge on the subject, though I of course respect anyone who chooses to use them, and if asked, I will obviously use them, but they're not hurting anyone, and I use extremely rarely. Besides, these laws are about deliberate misgendering, not using the wrong pronouns by accident a couple of times. Honestly, I don't get what these people find so difficult about respecting someone's gender and or pronouns. Why is it acceptable to harass someone to the point of suicide in the name of free speech, but not occasionally having to call your coworker Z? Bigotry is more important than human lives, apparently.
What might otherwise be a courtesy now has criminal consequences.
What once was a cause for incredibly high suicide rates is now no longer an issue. I genuinely don't see the problem here. Also, again, how is this in any way a bad thing?
In most contexts, I would have no problem addressing others in any manner they chose, and I'm sure most Americans feel the same. But the Constitution's protection of free speech neither begins nor ends with good manners. It extends all the way from rudeness to meekness, protecting those who hurl insults and those who would prefer to say nothing at all. If the state can compel the use of certain words, it can force those who differ into silence. It can force its citizens to parrot beliefs they do not hold.
But there are already limits on free speech though. You can't shout fire in a crowded theatre, and yes, you can't harass or discriminate against people. Sorry, being stopped from harassing or abusing people is the same as government censorship and or thought control is one hell of a take. And yes, slippery slope bullshit. If the government can punish kids for failing to respect the flag or pledge or whatever, then they can silence us. Or maybe, laws protecting vulnerable people will only lead to equality in a safer, better society.
The Fairfax County School District in Virginia removed the phrase biological gender from its curriculum and replaced it with the phrase sex assigned at birth.
Yes, because the phrase biological gender is nonsensical and actually makes no sense given recent scientific developments and, again, the existence of intersex people. I'd have thought it was a good thing for public school to keep up to date with a scientific consensus, but apparently not. And it's actually a bad thing if they prioritise scientific facts over conservatives' feelings. How do you get to a position where you think that the left is controlling the people whilst also wanting to poorly educate the nation's children into believing something you ideologically agree with, even if it's scientifically and factually incorrect? Hypocrisy on PragerU? Unheard of.
This is how the left legislates away the concept of biological sex without ever having to make the argument, without ever having to convince anyone.
No, this is how the left accepts the validity of the overwhelming majority of science and the consensus of the scientific community in order to accept that biological sex exists, but not only is it not a binary or as black and white as the right like to pretend it is, but it also isn't synonymous with gender. Most of these arguments are at least ideological and can therefore be properly argued against, but this last one is just denying the science, so what is there to say? These are the same people who constantly repeat the catchphrase,
"Facts don't care about your feelings."
And yet when the facts come up and actually contradict their precious feelings, as in this case, they lose their shit and cry censorship.
They're trying to make sex assigned at birth as trivial and malleable as name assigned at birth.
Maybe not that trivial and malleable, but let's be honest here, it's nowhere near as rigid as these people like to claim and certainly isn't as important.
As if some doctor arbitrarily chose for you on the day you were born.
Well, I mean, it's pretty arbitrary, and often not only is it just assigned to you without a choice in the matter, but many intersex people don't even realise that they are, because so many of them have surgery performed upon them in order to forcibly put them in either the male or female box. So many people born with male and female genitals have invasive and non-consensual surgery to remove one or the other, so they can easier fit into a society that wouldn't understand them. At least so the argument goes. You see all these anti-feminists and men's rights activists lose their shit over circumcision, but no one seems to really give a fuck about intersex rights or widespread phenomenon of cutting a baby's genitals off so they conform to societal expectations.
To the extent that the transgender movement seeks to promote compassion for those who struggle with their biological sex, we should be grateful for it. To the extent that it seeks to use government power to regulate our perspectives, commanding that we ignore biology and common sense, we should resist it.
Jesus Christ, these people are fucking unhinged. I'm not going to go over this again, but notice how often and how brazenly this lie is repeated. These laws and this legislation exist specifically and exclusively to protect marginalized people from harassment, but is described like this.
Let's say you're speaking to one person. I can't offend you. All right, fair enough. What if I'm speaking to 10 people? Do I get to offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? You're going to come out on stage and you're going to say something important about something vital, and you're not going to offend 1 person in 1,000? Well, you can't say anything about anything important ever without offending probably the person you're talking to. Important speech about important issues, especially contentious issues, is instantly offensive.
Holy shit. Also, notice that all these laws also refer to, for example, black people and give them protection from racially based prejudice and harassment, but no one's going on about that, almost as if it's frowned upon nowadays to complain about not being able to explicitly say racist shit, but trans people are fair game for some reason. Weird that.
This is no small issue. The Constitution guarantees freedom of speech so that political issues can be worked out in the public square. But the activist left doesn't want that conversation to occur. They want to force the adoption of their conclusions before the argument even begins.
This is just, we want to have the argument, we just don't want you to start harassing, abusing and invalidating marginalised people whilst we do it, but it's a pretty short argument anyway, because the vast majority of the facts and science are on our side, and all you have is hatred and whining about things changing, which Bob Dylan was lambasting conservatives for doing in 1964.
Compelled speech is the tactic they've chosen. It's unconstitutional, it's undemocratic, and it's wrong.
There are so many right-wing or conservative ideals one could describe as unconstitutional, undemocratic and wrong, especially like half the shit Trump has tried to push through, but you neglect to mention them. I wonder why.
If gender activists prevail, we may be left with a world we neither recognize nor like very much. We won't be able to communicate our displeasure. We will have lost the words. I'm Abigail Schreier for Prager University.
Oh no, everyone! If we stop harassment, abuse, and bigotry happening on an institutional and personal level, we'll have fallen to authoritarianism. It may not surprise you to learn that, contrary to what PragerU might believe, the left do not hate free speech. In fact, we're broadly in support of it. Likewise, when a law gets passed that prevents you from being able to harass or bully people over whom you have power, that is not an authoritarian attack on your freedoms, nor is it an insidious attempt to control your mind. You can say you find it ridiculous that leftists are so thin-skinned and get so offended when all you did is dehumanize people, make them feel unsafe, and use your power to cause them immense suffering if you like, but let's be honest here, you are the people who spend hours of your time and tons of money creating multiple slickly produced videos about how not offended you are, and that speaks volumes. Also, and I can't believe we still have to say this, freedom of speech already had limitations. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences, and inclusivity is actually the opposite of censorship. Are there really still people out there who unironically watch and enjoy this shit? Fuck me.
Is it water with the sheep in the box?
Hello everyone, this one's been a long time coming and it took me a long time to make. Usually this would have been seamless, but because I decided to push out my shoe on head video in order to make sure that it's not irrelevant by the time it came out, and to keep up with the discourse, there's probably been quite a bit of time between the release of that one and the release of this one, even though as I'm recording audio, it hasn't even actually gone up yet. I decided to keep this video as one full video as an experiment to see how it would compare to the previous episodes in the series I've done when I've split it down the middle. Anyway, you definitely know what we're doing here by now. The people currently on screen are the people who give me money each month, which at the moment just helps me get by, which is fantastic. And honestly, to all my patrons, thank you so much for everything. And if you want to have your name on screen as well, feel free to donate any amount to me on Patreon. However, if you want me to read out your name or username, or make me say a silly thing by changing your username to something really memey and weird, then I'm happy to do that if you donate more than $5 on Patreon to me, like so. Today I especially want to thank Emily. Next we have Ryan, it's Brian, Pixels Green, Stacey Solano, Susie M, Theodore Peklarov, Thomas McCallum, and Tom Newport. Links to my Patreon will currently be on screen at the moment, and I would invite you to come follow me on Twitter if you're so inclined. The link to my Twitter will be in the video description. I hope you're having a wonderful time. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out. Currently, actually let's just check. Yeah, currently I've reached 1 hour and 38 minutes of recording, and that's not even including all the clips from the PragerU videos that I'm responding to, although that probably will decrease. It probably will go down once I fully edit it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.